Hello, everybody. Welcome to our 11:30 press conference. I'm Peter Weiss. I'm the Public Information Manager for AGU. And just wanted to say, I don't know if we have any people who are not members of the press in the room, but we do reserve questions for members of the press. And we ask that when you do ask a question, we're going to pass around microphones. And if you'll use a microphone and say your name and your affiliation when you ask a question, we'd appreciate that very much. So this press conference is about climate change and civilizations. And our speakers, in the order in which they'll speak, are Sebastian Breitenbach. He's a postdoc in climate geology with ETH Zurich in Switzerland. And our second speaker is Matthew Konfirst. He's a Byrd Fellow in the Byrd Polar Research Center at Ohio State in Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah, hello, everybody. I'm invited to introduce you to the climate and civilization session. Why should we bother about climate and what has it to do with civilization? So I will just have a couple of slides and you can interrupt me whenever. For me, this climate proxy records are kind of echoes from the past. And this is important for us because we have about 1 billion people that depend directly on the rainfall in Asia or in India. And the water availability is a huge policy issue, as you all know. And there are serious concerns to the recent changes. So what is the past doing? Floods and droughts occurred every now and then. And I think we can help to assess future changes to come with understanding of the past. So where are we? Climatology is Central Asia. So if you use the cursor, maybe it's somewhere there. So we are more focusing on the Pakistani, Afghanistan region, but it has also a connection to Indian subcontinent, of course. In the winter, you have a high pressure cell over Tibet, and that changes over time in a seasonal scale. And you have the monsoon coming in June, and the Vesilis are maybe less influential in the summer. However, the direct interaction between monsoon and Vesilis is quite unknown. It's not so easy to disentangle in the past, and that's something we try to use proxy records for. So we use cave records from different regions, and I have here just 3 examples. Like the blue record would be stalagmite delta 018 records. We use isotopes from the carbonate to deduct changes in the monsoon strength. And the more negative the values become, I try to find a cursor here so that the online people can also see it. The more negative the numbers, the stronger the summer monsoon. We see that the last 11,000 years, the strongest monsoon was about 9,000, 8,000 years ago, and then it diminished since about 6,000 years or so. The similar picture is seen in China and also in the Arabian Peninsula, if you look at the green and black records. And they have often been referred to, and they have often been published and cited as proxy records for our climate change in this realm. However, we don't have much information on what's going on in Western India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia in general. And that's where we just need records. And the problem here is, and I should mention that there is an archaeological issue here as well, that, for example, the Harappans were a flourishing civilization in the Indus region, and they disappeared after about 3,800 BP, and we don't really know why. And before they did that, they moved from the Indus region into the Shivaliks close to the Himalaya. And that is known from archaeological findings. And the cursor disappeared again. So first they were here in the orange region, roughly. Then they moved closer to the Himalaya foothills. And that they did, apparently, because they got more moisture from the monsoon in this area. And they used the floods that came every spring to have a sophisticated irrigation system. Later on, they disappeared. And we can just argue that there is a link to a weakening monsoon. Now the Persians did a similar thing. They were a flourishing society in Central Asia, and they also disappeared, and we don't know why, again. And maybe there's a similar feature here, that they also depended on agriculture, on irrigation. And one hypothesis would be that if you change the moisture availability, you change the availability of water for irrigation, and cultures could just be strongly affected by that. So here's another picture. It's a little younger. It's between 2.6 and 1.3 kilo years ago. And we could just argue there's a link to climate change. But we do not know much because we have not enough information from the paleoclimate proxy records. That has to do with the situation there at the moment. As you know, there's a war going on. Many regions are just no-go areas. If you look at Afghanistan or Pakistan, we just started working in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, but these records are not outdated yet. It looks very promising though. And another issue is that you often need the yes or no from the local chiefs. So if you go to Tibet, if you go to northern India, Himalayas, then many caves are just not accessible simply because they're venerated. They are sacred places. And even if you get the yes of local people, that means you can maybe visit it, but you're still not allowed to sample it. If you go for northern Himalaya, for example, like northern Indian Himalaya, then we had the situation that we found nice stalagmites that we would like to use for climate reconstructions, but we couldn't get them because they're venerated as Shiva Linga, which is like a structure that is venerated for its value for reproduction or fertility symbolism. And so there's no way to take these samples. A similar situation is also present in Tibet. Many caves are just sacred, and they're so sacred that you are not even allowed to go in. We just had this experience a week ago or two. And so there are issues not only on a politics, that you can just not go there because of war or whatever, but there's also a religious side. And as a researcher, you have to keep that in mind, and you have to also take it into a respect, because you should not just go there and take a sample and don't care about what the local people say. It can just be that they are offended, but it can also end up in physical harm for you. And with this, I'm already done with my introduction. And I'm happy to get questions from you all. Otherwise, I think Matthew has some more slides to show. Thank you.
All right, hello. I'm going to talk about actually a similar time frame. So the Harappan civilization that was just mentioned, this is a similar time period. About 4,200 years ago, there was a drought in the Middle East, and this wasn't a single summer or a couple of summers. This was 200 to 300 years of drought conditions. So this is attested to in the climate record by a number of records. So I'll point with this. So here is Mesopotamia. It's the region that we're talking about. And all these colored dots around the region are different records that show that there was a very strong drought that began about 4,200 years ago. This has already been linked in the literature to the collapse of the Acadian civilization. So the Acadians first established this empire, the first empire that the world has ever seen, established by Sargon, lasted for almost 2 centuries, and collapses suddenly about 4,200 years ago as Guti, Gutian invaders attack the empire. So this Acadian collapse has been, again, fairly well documented in the literature, both archaeological and climate. And a recent paper has actually talked about how this drought wasn't just a single event, it wasn't just a severe event, even lasting decades. This was something that lasted centuries. And so within that time frame, there was actually another wave of invasions caused by people displaced by drought. And those people, can you hear me better now? Okay. So there was actually a second wave of migration. So there were the Amorite people. They were semi-nomadic herders, lived west of Mesopotamia, and began to migrate into Mesopotamia at about the same time that droughts were occurring within Mesopotamia itself, within southern Mesopotamia itself. The droughts and the movement of these people sort of overwhelmed resources, and people from the east, the Elamites, took advantage of this at the very end, and the Sumerian civilization collapsed about 2000 BC as the Elamites sacked the city of Ur, one of the oldest cities in this region. So all of this is interesting, but it's also interesting because the languages that were spoken in this region included two primary ones. So here in southern Mesopotamia, there was a language called Sumerian that was spoken. This is the oldest written language. This is the oldest language that we have written records for. And in the more northern regions of southern Mesopotamia, Acadian was spoken. Acadian is a Semitic language. It's related to Babylonian and Assyrian, and eventually to languages like modern languages like Hebrew and Arabic. And so having these Semitic languages in this region, actually, that's how the region is characterized today. Arabic and Hebrew are two major languages, but 4,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, Sumerian was a major language. And so what happened as these invaders came in and the final dynasty of the Sumerian kings fell apart is that Sumerian disappears then from the written record. And so we essentially lose a language at this time period that has no modern analogs. So it's sort of a whole branch of the language tree that disappears. It does actually stick around in a written form. So scholars use this language the same way that scholars in the Middle Ages used Latin. It's a dead language, but they use it to write, be scholarly. And somewhere in the 1st century AD, this language then disappears for almost 2,000 years before it's unearthed again by people poking around in the Middle East in the 19th century. Yeah, so with that, I think I'll close my opening remarks and open it up to questions for both of us.
Okay, we're ready for questions. Who would like to ask a question? No takers? And these are questions from press. And please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Ryder Miller, freelance. What do you suggest is the option? I mean, with what sort of changes are going to stop this process from continuing and continuing?
You're addressing me, is that right? Or, well, what we know is just a change in a geochemical system. And if this is, and we have to calibrate or we have to connect this to rainfall changes, for example. And then we can just see how is that related to archaeological findings. And often there's, in both, there's a problem of chronology. Often you have to first date it and the datings are not as accurate as you want. So sometimes the relationship may be there, maybe not. Is that what you ask, or not really?
Yeah,
Hi, Rich Monastersky with Nature. Oh, do you want to?
Yeah, one of the things we were kind of just talking about just before we got started with this is how some of these civilizations that we're looking at, in Central Asia or within the Middle East, are civilizations that are sort of perched on a precarious edge to begin with. So as far as the Sumerian and Acadian civilizations go, they were able to use irrigation to grow crops in the southern part of the Middle East. Rainfall is not significant enough in the southern part to actually support agriculture, and so it was this infrastructure essentially that allowed them to weather the storm in a certain sense. In the more northerly regions, there's more rainfall, and 5,000 years ago, that was enough rainfall to for crops to grow. And so when this drought came, it essentially decreased the rainfall enough where without irrigation, without the canals, they were not able to pursue agriculture in this region. And so I think in some ways the resilience of the southern portion of Mesopotamia is owed to the infrastructure that they had in place. I don't know if that addresses your question.
Hi, Rich Monastersky with Nature. This whole question of climate control on civilizations has been around for a long time. It's often correlational. What is new here? What are you presenting that's new? And how do you go beyond this just correlation in time to actually address whether you've got an external control on civilization collapse or if it's an internal dynamics within the society itself?
You're right. Yes, there's been lots of this been around before. So, for example, for the Maya, we can see similarities. And also for the Acadian Empire, there's been lots of publications already on that topic. However, there are always ambiguities about the dating, and can you really make this relation? Is it just determinism in a way that is just a fantasy or hypothesis? And there, I think we can help with our proxy records because we can give them very strict chronologies using stalagmites. We have dating uncertainties that are much, much smaller than using marine records, for example. And if you take this marine terrestrial stuff again, terrestrial records from caves are much more closer to the sites that we are talking about. So in Belize, maybe just below the ruins. In India, not yet, because it's a no-go area, but we are working on that. But they are much more sensitive than marine records may be. And still, we have to look at different records, and we have to use a very strong collaboration with archaeologists. I mean, we cannot just, as a climatologist, I cannot just say this is climate that determines it all. No, certainly not. And the rainfall change alone would probably be not the only reason. It's almost never the case. There's always a multiple, like a system where you have multiple factors that influence each other. And if things go worse or bad, then it may be just a turning point, the tipping point. So, for example, in the Harappan system, as you said before, it's a very similar system. You have an irrigation system that is extremely extensive. The Indus culture had one of the largest irrigation systems in the world at that time. And they were dependent not only on the rainwater that would not suffice, it's not enough, but they also used the floods from the snowmelt in early spring. So if one of these sources fails, you are in trouble. And you can be very smart, you can adapt, but at some point it will not help anymore. And maybe we can learn lessons here for the future, because it looks like in India at least, that the monsoon gets more variable and hence less predictable, because it's not quite certain if you get as much rainfall as you want, or maybe too much to get your crops fail. And maybe we can learn from the past and address issues like adaptation.
And I think another thing maybe to point out is when we talk about, Acadian civilization collapsed, it almost sounds like hyperbole. I mean, the Acadians themselves were still around. It's just that the existing institutions changed. Civilization didn't disappear completely. People didn't leave the Middle East and not occupy the region ever again. So the idea of, I think maybe the terminology sort of draws up connotations of this hyperbolic speech. But I think that, in these regions where you're sort of close to being on the edge, when the rains are good, everything's good, and if the rains stop, there's no savings in the bank, so to speak. And I think that makes civilizations of the past, in particular, more prone to these disruptions. Now today, we're more interconnected. We know things, immediately if there's a typhoon, if there's an earthquake across, the other side of the globe. We know that, and we can send help, and we have the resources to do that. But in an older age, when you didn't have that much connections that were that strong, or that didn't have the technology to come in and rescue the people who were having problems, I think in older civilizations, this idea of collapse is probably more of an issue.
Do we have any other questions?
One from a non-journalist. She's not a journalist.
Yes, hi, John Karachuski, freelance. I'm not familiar with all the work, but there's a professor at the University of Washington, David Montgomery, who wrote a popular book about soil and how there may have been over-farming and erosion of soil that also led to, was another factor in the collapse of civilizations. I wasn't sure how that related to or complemented some of your work.
Well, I'm not aware of this particular work, though. I think, yes, there is possibly a connection. I mean, if you look at the Dust Bowl situation, you can, with heavier winds in a dry situation, you can just erode away the soil. Or you bring dust from somewhere else, and you just cover the fertile soil with some aeolian deposit that you cannot use for growing anything. If this is something particularly important in the Indus region, for example, I don't know. I have not enough data for that to support it. But it's certainly something to keep in mind. It's not only just the water available that is a major factor. It's also wind changes and erosion by wind, or deposition by wind. If you look in the west or east of the Indus system, you have the Thar Desert. So if you just move the dunes by a little bit, you can destroy oases. That's why you also find archaeological relics in this desert, because they're preserved below the dunes. So yeah, maybe that's another factor.
Yeah, I'm also not familiar with the book specifically, but with the idea in general, and it's an interesting thing maybe to look into. Some of the proxy records for the Middle East actually do indicate greater aeolian deposition. So lakes, for example, dried out, and aeolian derived sediments filled in those lakes. There's also evidence for increased dust from the Zagros Mountains coming into marine cores in the region. So that is something to look into. And again, these are all interconnected factors. Actually, to come back to that other question, climate itself is sort of a fabric that society builds itself upon, and so there are a number of interconnecting things, whether you're talking about societal or governmental, or there are a number of factors that interact to produce the results that we would call history.
Do we have other questions? Questions from the chat? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming here. Thank you, panelists, for speaking. Appreciate it very much. Our next press event will be at 12:30. It's media availability with scientists from the Voyager mission. NASA did a teleconference at 11 a.m. With these same scientists. Two of them will be here. One will be calling in from Greece. And this is just an opportunity for the press who's here to speak with them about whatever they said at 11. I missed it, so I hope you guys got it.